Hey guys, so for the past few weeks I've been totally isolated in my dorm room at college, and I've been trying to get adjusted to being all alone all the time. And I'm sure that many of us, as we close our doors and move inside, are struggling with the ups and downs of life in isolation. So during these difficult times, I did what I always do when faced with struggle, which is to find refuge in art. And this sort of got me thinking about the relationship between art, or any kind of creative endeavor, and isolation. The French writer Colette once wrote, "There are days when solitude is a heady wine that intoxicates you with freedom, others when it is a bitter tonic, and still others when it is a poison that makes you beat your head against the wall." So, how do creatives deal with isolation? How does art itself approach loneliness? And what can we learn from artists about being alone? So without further ado, welcome to Artists and Isolation, a virtual exhibition made up of a collection of rooms. Let me show you through the artists on display today and talk you through the lessons that we might be able to learn from each of them. Room A, Freedom. We walk into the first room to find that it is not a single room, but the interior of what looks to be a white chapel. We are standing inside Ellsworth Kelly's Austin, a pavilion not dedicated to a religious creed, but instead to creativity and contemplation itself. But let me back up a bit and tell you a bit more about the artist. Kelly was an American painter, sculptor, and printmaker known for his abstract, hard-edge painting and minimalist artwork. He was also a notorious recluse. Known as a loner from a young age, Kelly often described the liberation he found in solitude and anonymity. In a 1996 interview, he spoke about moving to Paris and being alone in the city. He said, "Paris was great after the war. I liked being alone. I liked being a stranger. I didn't speak French very well, and I liked the silence." And although our current period of isolation is very different from the one that Kelly is describing here, there is an element to a solitude that we might be able to relate to, which is the freedom that comes with being alone. Isolation is a safe space to explore freely, without fear of consequences. There's a kind of paradoxical anonymity that accompanies being with yourself that is liberating, and I think this fact can ease a lot of the tension and claustrophobia we might feel when stuck at home. There is also a contemplative sense one can feel when alone, and Kelly's paintings reflect this. You may notice that they feature bright colors and bold abstract shapes. They seem loud, but really his works invite contemplation. His minimalist compositions and uninformative titles allow the viewer to construct the meaning in his works for themselves, engaging in a moment of solitary contemplation that mirrors Kelly's artistic process. From Kelly, we can learn our first lesson about solitude, that solitude and anonymity offers us a tremendous amount of freedom that can be comfortable and even therapeutic. As you approach the center of the chapel, you notice a podium on which sit a couple of books, The Metamorphosis, The Judgment, The Castle. Let's talk about Franz Kafka, another solitary creative. Many of the German writer's novels famously explore themes of alienation and absurdity, as his isolated protagonists experience bizarre and surreal episodes. Isolation, however, was not limited to the content of his novels, but also during Kafka's own creative process. There's a story of Kafka's wife asking him if she could sit with him while he wrote, to which he replied, "Listen, in that case I cannot write at all, for writing means revealing oneself to excess, the utmost of self-revelation and surrender, in which a human being, when involved with others, would feel he was losing himself, and from which, therefore, he will always shrink as long as he is in his right mind. That is why one can never be alone enough when one writes, why even night is not night enough." Kafka teaches us that only in solitude can one be free to create without bounds. Complete isolation is necessary for the creative endeavor. This brings us to our second room, Room B, Creativity. You walk out of the pavilion's door to enter a small artist's bedroom. It is tidy, small, and humble. We are in a room of Agnes Martin's Adobe home in New Mexico. Martin is one of my favorite artists, so I couldn't not include her in this video, but she is also a prime example of an artist who worked in isolation. Martin was a Canadian-born painter who worked primarily in New York and later in New Mexico, creating abstract paintings that captured the immaterial. As an artist, she insisted that art was not an instrument for social change, but instead, the value of art lay in the ability to counteract negative thoughts and emotions, promote psychic calm over chaos, and establish stability in a world full of unpredictability and potentially devastating changes. Near the end of Martin's life, she painted a series of paintings called With My Back to the World. The title of the series reflected her own life. See, in the middle of her career, she abandoned the busy New York art world for a peaceful, isolated adobe home in New Mexico, where she lived in total isolation. The world was behind her, and she lived only with herself and her art. And in her paintings, this abandonment of the chaotic material world is deeply visible. Her work seeks to capture not the material, but instead the immaterial, emotion, inspiration, and the non-objective itself. From Martin, we learn that through solitude, we can engage with calmness, establish stability, and find inspiration. You look around the room, looking at Martin's small collection of belongings. You notice on her drawer is a copy of Virginia Woolf's A Room of One's Own. It's perfect because Martin's adobe home was just the kind of space Woolf described when she talked about having a room of one's own, both a physical and mental space where one can recharge and rediscover oneself. She poetically described it as a stage for a single actor, a house of soliloquy, a studio of rich internal echoes, a closet of expression, a safe cell for the incubation of ideas. Woolf's own characters reflect the restorative quality of time spent alone. In her descriptive yet emotionally potent novels, her characters are often seen navigating the busy outside world with a contemplative inner world. Perhaps this can teach us a bit about what we can gain from a period of social isolation. Woolf teaches us that solitude is both a physical and mental space where we can recharge and rediscover. Let's move on to the next room. Room C, Reflection and Growth. As you walk out of this humble room, you are surprised to walk into a room full of spectacle. It is a room full of mirrors that makes whatever is in the room appear like it is being multiplied forever in all directions. You look at your kaleidoscopic reflections and the infinite lanterns and immediately recognize Yayoi Kusama's art. Kusama is a Japanese contemporary artist who is famously known for her works that feature polka dots and repeating patterns. The artist has spent the last 5 decades in a psychiatric hospital and is thus very familiar with isolation and solitude. Kusama speaks about art as if it is medicine. She once said that had it not been for art, she would have been dead a long time ago. Kusama suffers from various mental illnesses, but art, it seems, provides a cure. Kusama's version of solitude is one that involves self-reflection and understanding what she needs for her soul. In her case, it is creating art, but it may be something different for you. You ponder this as you stare at your infinitely multiplying reflections. Suddenly, a screen lights up in front of you, and well, behind you and beside you and all around you as the screen is reflected across the room. It is a clip from the classic film The Seventh Seal. It is a fantastic clip, but today we're a bit more interested in the artist who created this film, Ingmar Bergman. Bergman, a renowned Swedish director, described in his autobiography, "Here in my solitude, I have the feeling that I contain too much humanity." When alone, you're really faced with the totality of your own self, and it can be difficult. Bergman, however, was able to channel these periods of self-confrontation into creative energy. He was one of the most influential directors of the 20th century, his films being stunning studies of the human condition, examining what it is to be human and how we humans experience the world. For Bergman, the time spent alone wasn't only generative, but also insightful and productive towards his own self-understanding. Thus, Bergman shows us that in solitude we are confronted with ourselves, and we have the option of channeling this confrontation into art. Room D, Time. For the next collection of artists, you step into a tiny little room. On one wall is the art of Ray Maderson, on the opposite, art by Barbara S., and hanging from the ceiling is an installation by Haegue Yang. There's a lot going on in this small space. Let's start with the Maderson. The art of Ray Maderson deals with self-understanding, with added elements of self-discipline and reminder. Meterson's work is astounding in both its context and form. His pieces are miniature, embroidered pieces that Meterson created while serving his 15-year prison sentence. They measure about 2.5 by 3 inches, each requiring about 1,200 stitches per square inch, depicting scenes from daily prison life and scenes from Meterson's own past that had been marked by a struggle with drug abuse. He speaks about his art making as a means of finding a way to spend the time while reminding himself of the harsh realities of his drug addiction. He says, "I had to remind myself of the prison, so to speak, that got me literally locked up. That was my addiction to drugs." Our own period of isolation is uncertain and seems like it could go on for months without end. From Meterson, we can learn to channel this time into creating something while engaging in self-reflection and improvement. Let's turn to the opposite wall. While Meterson's depictions of daily life served as a mode of self-reflection, Barbara S. approaches it as a means of noticing what's around you. S., an American photographer well known for her work with a pinhole camera, was confined to her home for a month, sick from bronchitis. During this period of isolation, S. began photographing her home, noticing previously ignored details of her immediate environment. This work culminated in her Shut-In series, a group of dreamy, hazy photographs that enhance the contemplation and rediscovery that is only available to people in moments of solitary stillness. From S., we can see that solitude can be a chance for a delicate engagement with our surroundings, heightening our sense of awareness and noticing details that we hadn't before. And finally, let's talk about the installation in the room, Haegue Yang. Yang is an artist who seeks out loneliness. Her work deals with themes of migration, post-colonial diasporas, enforced exile, and social mobility in her ambitious installations that seem to crop up all around the world. While her work is quite separate from the theme of loneliness itself, solitude marks her creative process. Yang is known for deliberately isolating herself from friends and family to apply intense focus on her various artistic projects, seeking out solitude in order to create. In an interview, Yang once said, "What comes along with the intensity of the work is you almost lose yourself. I think the confusion is good to have." From Yang, there is simply the fact that solitude gives us time to apply deep focus to our passions, to the point where you lose track of time and fall into it completely. Room E. Despair. We walk into the final room. It's some kind of night cafe. No, not that one. This one. Oh yes, we must talk about Vincent van Gogh. Unlike many of the artists that have already been mentioned, Van Gogh struggled with his loneliness for years, battling depression and schizophrenia. Many of his works elicit this sense of empty melancholy one experiences when alone. In 1889, during his time at the asylum at Saint-Rémy-de-Provence, where he famously painted The Starry Night, Van Gogh wrote to his sister, saying, "I haven't left my room for 2 months. I don't know why. The feeling of loneliness takes hold of me in the fields in such a fearsome way that I hesitate to go out. With time, though, that will change. It's only in front of the easel while painting that I feel life." Van Gogh struggled with isolation and loneliness, and yet was able to find some kind of remedy while painting. He also famously said, "For my part, I know nothing with any certainty, but the sight of the stars makes me dream." Van Gogh teaches us that solitude can be painful. He also teaches us that art can be a cure. And that's the end of my virtual exhibition. As Colette said, isolation can be both good and bad, and clearly experiences with isolation vary from artist to artist, all of their strategies for dealing with isolation being wildly different from one another. And yet, perhaps we can learn something from them and apply them to our own lives, not only during these difficult times, but moving forward as well. There are many artists and creatives I have not mentioned who either were famous recluses or made artwork that dealt with themes of loneliness. Joseph Cornell, Emily Dickinson, Henry Thoreau, Frida Kahlo, Edward Hopper, and many, many more artists have been shaped by isolation, loneliness, and solitude. This speaks to the scope of my question. The experience with being alone marks everyone in a distinct manner. I hope this video gave you some inspiration towards how to relate to your own self during these solitary months, even if you're not completely alone. Stay safe, keep creating art, and I'll see you in the next one.